Boone said the baptizer's name even now, and she readied herself for the sight of its face. She had it too, but from inside the flame, as the creature there, not dead but alive, not Midian's subject but its creator, rolled its head over in the turmoil of flame and looked her way. This was Baphomet, this diced and divided thing. Seeing its face, she screamed. No story or movie screen, no desolation, no bliss had prepared her for the maker of Midian. Sacred it must be, as anything so extreme must be sacred. A thing beyond things, beyond love or hatred or their sum, beyond the beautiful or the monstrous or their sum, beyond, finally, her mind's power to comprehend or catalogue. In the instant she looked away from it, she had already blanked every fraction of the sight from conscious memory and locked it where no torment or entreaty would ever make her look again. She hadn't known her own strength till the frenzy to be out of its presence had her hauling Boone to his feet and dragging him up the slope. He could do little to help her. The time he'd spent in the baptizer's presence had driven all but the rags of power from his muscles. It seemed to Laurie that it took an age staggering up to the head of the slope, the flames' icy light throwing their shadows before them like prophecies. The passageway above was deserted. She had half expected Lylesburg to be in wait, somewhere with more solid cohorts, but the silence of the chamber below had spread throughout the tunnel. Once she had hauled Boone a few yards from the summit of the slope, she halted, her lungs burning with the effort of bearing him up. He was emerging from the daze of grief or terror she'd found him in. "Do you know a way out of here?" she asked him. "I think so," he said. "You're going to have to give me some help. I can't support you much longer." He nodded, then looked back at the entrance to Baphomet's pit. "What did you see?" he asked. "Nothing." "Good." By the way, before we go on to the analysis portion of this video, an apology. There's going to be a slight editing, a transition in a moment, because I'm filming this all arse out of whack. I think I've actually already filmed the analysis portion of this video, and was just looking for a segment or a portion that I'd like to read for it. So, without further ado, the analysis of Cabal. Cabal, interesting one. Very, very, very short book, this one. I read this in a couple of days at most, which I was working most of, because it's not only a very short book, it's a novella technically. It's only like, I mean, half that much is actually a teaser for Weworld, which is one we'll be getting onto very soon, and that one, expect probably quite a long video for that one, because that one has unfathomable personal resonance for me. I have that one. I need to spend some time on. Although that won't be what's coming up next. Coming up next is the Damnation game, which is also very, very, very good. But most of that is a teaser for Weworld. So the book itself is longer than it feels. Certainly 240 pages, longer than it feels, much longer than it feels. So it's like a long novella rather than a novel, really. And the reason it feels like it's smaller, it's shorter, is because of the way it's written. I don't know whether Barker wrote the film script first, or whether he wrote the book and the film. The film is Nightbreed, by the way, simultaneously. But it's very filmic. The novel is very, very filmic in terms of its rhythm. It's very easy to read. It's very visual. Everything hurtles along at a breakneck pace. There's not, and it's not as though anything is underbaked or anything to that effect. It actually does take quite a lot of time to establish character and to establish mood and all of that stuff. It's just that it does so with a degree of elegance and economy. It does away with some of the weightier stuff. It's not quite as dense or as I don't want to use words like belabored, because that's not the case for books like Weworld or Imagica or the Damnation game. They are like twice or three times the size of this, but they're not belabored to any great degree. Everything in them works. It's just that it's not quite. It doesn't take time to linger over things. Cabal. Every scene feels like it could be derived from a film or from a TV show, and everything is described in very visual form. Which I imagine is as a result of Barker's experience filming Hellraiser and operating in Hollywood at this point, and of indeed creating the film of Nightbreed. And we have to talk about the film version of Cabal, Nightbreed, because it's such an odd beastie. The cinematic version, the form that was released to cinemas in, I think it was the late 1980s, early 1990s, isn't great. It's an interesting piece of work, but it's very uneven and it's rhythmically weird, and there are odd things about it. And the reason it's so flawed by and large is because it was butchered by all accounts. But what the studios wanted from Barker obviously was another Hellraiser. They wanted another another horror film that was going to appeal to an established audience, and Barker didn't give them that. What he gave them is this, which it's a transitional work in many respects. It marks Barker's shift away from horror as such. Although there's plenty of horrific material in here, it's more of it's more akin to works like Weave World and Imagica, which are these epic fantasies, I suppose, these epic metaphysical fantasies, which have horror elements in them, but also have elements of science fiction, of religion, of mythology, of all sorts of stuff. This is the beginning of that. And the film marks that too. The film, like the book, is essentially, in many respects, it's a parody of horror. It's an inversion of horror tropes. What you have in both Cabal and Nightbreed is a situation in which the monsters, the eponymous Nightbreed, are not innocent as such. They're far from innocent. They're monsters, and therefore they act monstrously. But they are preferable to the human characters and the forces of order and civilization, all of which are betrayed in the book and the film. They're betrayed as hypocritical at best, and as totally monstrous in themselves at worst. You have Decker, who is the antagonist of the piece, who in the film is played by David Cronenberg. Not an actor, that much is clear, but actually his particular coldness and the sort of stilted nature of his performance works really well for Decker, who is he is the psychiatrist of the main character. And this is another oddity of this work. The protagonists are all these ambiguous, wounded, strange, and not entirely attractive characters. Boone, who is the arguably the main protagonist of this book, along with his sort of girlfriend, not quite, he's a very strange figure. He's stranger in the book than he is in the film, actually. In the book, he is a genuinely disturbed individual. He starts as someone who has these incredible lapses in memory, doesn't quite know who he is or what he's doing, possibly schizophrenic, certainly depressive, with bouts of suicidalism. He's a really unusual figure for stories like this, and certainly for fiction, horror fiction in the 1980s. There is a tendency for horror fiction in the 1980s for protagonists to be a cut above the normal herd. There's something about them that makes them not superhuman as such, but better. It makes them more capable. It makes them natural leaders. It makes them more knowledgeable or more aware. That's not the case here. Boone is tossed from ship to shore and back again by circumstance, because he is this lost, wounded, scrabbling figure. And his psychiatrist, Decker, has been grooming him, I suppose, over a year or two of sessions to convince him that he is responsible for a series of really hideous, almost ritualistic murders, which, of course, it turns out that Decker is responsible for. Decker is the psychiatrist psychopath. He's a complete nutcase who he kills for no particular reason. That's the point of Decker. He's this hollow figure in both the book and the figure and in the film, whereas Boone, who finds himself cast adrift to the gates of an almost semi-mythical American town called Midian. Boone doesn't actually kill, I don't think, in this book, but finds himself becoming one of these entities, these lost souls called the Nightbreed, who are, like himself, wanderers, people who are outcasts, exiles, who have been touched by some very obscure god or divinity that calls itself Baphomet, or is called Baphomet, rather. And as a result of that touch, is transformed. He is transformed into something mythical. He is transformed into a Nightbreed, a thing that's not quite human, that is not quite alive, that is not quite dead, that exists according to mythological tropes, I suppose. It's almost like it's werewolf-like. The Nightbreed are liminal. They're not literally werewolves as such, but they tread the same thematic path, I suppose. They are creatures that can shift between states of humanity and not humanity, and the states of not humanity are luridly and deliciously described in the book. I mean, in one of the problems with the film is that it was produced at a time when perhaps the vision of the book, and quite likely the vision of the script, wasn't possible to fulfill, just because of the constraints of technology. One of the first Nightbreeds you encounter, who is a creature called Peliquin, he is described as exhaling and inhaling his own features. So he exhales and the monster sifts out of him in smoke form and then coalesces around him, solidifies for a moment, and then dissolves again and is breathed back in. That's brilliant. That's wonderful. That's what Boone does later as well. It's how Boone becomes his monstrous self, and it's not really that well realized in the film, sadly, because it just couldn't be. I mean, there was just not the technology and likely not the budget available to do it. It's not terrible at all in the film. It actually works rather well, but it's very different from the visions that are described here. The visions in the book are much more they're much more delirious, I suppose. There is a nightmare, dreaming, hallucinatory quality to this book, as there is for a lot of Barker's work. Certainly from here on out. I mean, it becomes... After this, Barker's work becomes simultaneously more solid and less solid. It becomes more robust and more detailed and more confident in terms of describing very complex ideas. But those ideas become much more abstruse and much more bizarre and much more difficult to describe or communicate to the reader. And that's part of their charm. It's part of why Barker's books work, and it's why they distinguish themselves. It's why they distinguish themselves, arguably in his heyday, which was between the late 1980s and the mid 1990s. That's the sort of the golden age for Barker's work. That's when you get the books that change the genre, that change the format, that change how people write. You get Weave World, which is the reason I write full stop. Weave World is the book that made me pick up pen and put it to paper. Weave World is that book. Okay, you get books like the books of the art, The Great and Secret Show, and Everville, which need to be fucking finished. Where you get Galilee, which is another one that needs to be fucking finished, and Imagica, which is arguably Barker's magnum opus. I mean, I think Barker himself has said that he probably won't write anything like Imagica ever again, to the same scale or the same weight or depth or profundity. And I can see why. I've actually started reading Imagica for this series before I started reading anything else, because it is such a big book and it's so dense. You need that time, not only to read it, but to then digest it, to give an even halfway accurate idea of what that book is about. I needed to start reading that first because it's huge. It's the culmination of everything Barker writes about. Everything that is essentially Clive Barker is in that book. But anyway, back to Cabal. I found it very readable. It's much less, say, alienating than some of Barker's other works. I mean, one of the issues Barker faces is that he's essentially an independent writer made good. His work isn't always, or rather, it's the kind of stuff that you wouldn't expect to be popular or to function in on a popular scale, because it's so bizarre. It's so alienating. There is a tendency for people who like, say, Stephen King or who like more traditional works of horror not to like Clive Barker. And I can see for why, especially reading like so Cabal, because it is ambiguous and it is bizarre, and it does not, what stories like Cabal do not do is reinforce cultural narrative, which most horror does. Certainly most horror from the 1980s when this was written. There is a slight deviance in them, certainly from, say, Stephen King and whatnot, which is all about behind the picket fences. It's about small town hypocrisy and the lie of the American dream and blah, 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 and the nuclear family and blah, 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 blah. It's all that. But there is this tendency at the end of those tales, despite what questions are raised, for the status quo to be reinforced or to be to sustain. The towns generally do not dissolve in Stephen King's work. They don't like fall in on themselves or collapse or erupt into spontaneous anarchy or anything like that. They do in Barker's work. They do. Things fall apart in Barker's work. There is an anarchist quality to them. There's like, it's like, certainly to works from this period, and Cabal is no exception. You have in Cabal law and order revealing itself as being brutality and oppression. You have religion revealing itself as being hypocrisy and emptiness. And you have psychology being revealed as a mask for psychopathy. Whereas the monstrous, the creatures that follow their eccentricities and their strangeness and allow for it, become exalted. They become mythical essences of themselves, who are very happy in their conditions. That's the interesting thing about Barker. He gives you monsters who are happy to be monsters. It's something you get in Hellraiser as well. The Cenobites are very happy to be Cenobites, it seems. Pinhead likes being Pinhead. All the other Cenobites seem to enjoy themselves very, very much. And the Nightbreed are no exception. In fact, there are characters in this book who go in search of Midian, the mythical city, biblical reference, by the way, who go in search of the mythical city where the Nightbreed live and where Baphomet can remake them. Now, it's a risk, by all accounts, because the Nightbreed don't just take anybody. If Baphomet's his representatives amongst the Nightbreed, like Lylesburg, who is played in the film by Doug Bradley, who played Pinhead. If Lylesburg and his priests don't declare you worthy, then they'll eat you. They will, they act monstrously, and monsters eat people. That's what they do. But if you do pass muster, if you are one that Midian calls to, then you become something amazing. You become what Ogden Nash would call a miracle. I mean, in his book Dragons Are Essential, Ogden Nash said that wherever there's a monster, there's a miracle, and that's this book to a T. That's what Cabal is. It's about the miracle of monsters and the sublimated evil of those who don't believe themselves to be monsters, or don't believe that they could be monsters. That's the whole gist of this book, and it's actually a real joy to read. It's very quick, very, very, just breeze right through it. It's a mythology I would really like to see more of, and it's one I know Barker has spoken about doing more of ages ago. There was talk once, I remember, of Barker writing a sequel to Cabal in which the Nightbreed would come up against the Cenobites, because the Cenobites are the opposite of the Nightbreed in many respects. They're monsters who enjoy their monstrosity, but they are order. The Cenobites are all about order and rigidity and ritual and process, whereas the Nightbreed aren't. They're anarchy, and they're embracing chaos and allowing structure to dissolve. That's the point of the Nightbreed. And it's fantastic. It doesn't surprise me at all that this plays very well. This book seems to play very well amongst Barker's fans, because it appeals to that deviant, that almost universal deviance, that sense of transgression that we all exhibit, every single one of us. I think the one thing that would unite all Barker fans, I believe, is a love of the transgressive, and a sense that we ourselves are like the Nightbreed, that there is something, that we are outside of the structures looking in, and that we perceive the evils of them, that are innate to them and that are accepted, and which are just blithely either ignored or assimilated by those who are more willfully part of them or who are simply blind to them. That's what Cabal is. That's what Nightbreed is. In fact, there is a better version of Nightbreed out there now. There is a new cut of Nightbreed, which has been restored. A lot of the stuff that was cut out has been restored, and by all accounts, it's a lot better. It's a much more successful piece of work. I actually think that Cabal and Nightbreed could potentially benefit from a remake. I mean, I know horror remakes are almost universally a pile of shit, although they can be done well. John Carpenter's The Thing is a remake of The Thing from Outer Space, 1950s film, so it can be done well. And John Carpenter's The Thing is fantastic. David Cronenberg's The Fly is a remake of the Fly starring Vincent Price, which is a very different film, and Cronenberg's is just spectacularly superior. They can be done well, and I believe this is something that could be done better, with maybe not with a bigger budget as such, because it's not necessarily a matter of budget, it's a matter of invention, but with modern technology to realize some of the more bizarre and abstruse images in here. I like Barker's films a lot, but I don't think he's not as apposite a director as some others who have worked upon his short stories and whatnot. I mean, I can't remember who it was, but the guy who directed The Candyman was very good, very, very good indeed. Made an absolute joy of that adaptation, really did. So yes, a new version of Nightbreed, or just an adaptation of Cabal, would be most welcome, most welcome. Yes, so that's the transitional Cabal. Next up, another one that I've already read, actually, because again, it's quite big and it was quite dense to get through. So the next book will be The Damnation Game. See you then.